I always thought fathers were supposed to protect you from the world. But mine, he was the world I had to be protected from. Growing up, my dad, Arthur Blake, was the kind of man everyone else respected. Neighbors waved when he walked by. He coached Little League. He was the guy at every community meeting with a confident opinion and a firm handshake. To the outside world, he looked like a leader. To me, he was a constant reminder that I was never enough. My name is Ethan Blake, and if you're watching this, then you're probably wondering how I ended up selling the house my father lived in, the house worth over $800,000, and left him to deal with the aftermath. But this isn't a revenge story in the way you think. This is about how a man's words can rot a boy from the inside out, and how one decision can finally set that boy free. I was the only child, which meant everything my father wanted, he projected onto me. He wanted a football player. I hated sports. He wanted a business prodigy. I loved sketching and architecture. He wanted someone to mirror him. I wanted to be anything but him. The first time he called me a failure, I was 11. I had spent hours on a science project. I was proud, so proud, because I had made a working model of a wind turbine. I even printed little labels for each part. He glanced at it, frowned, and said, "Looks flimsy. A real engineer wouldn't waste time on that crap." I remember pretending I didn't care. I remember throwing the whole thing away the next morning before school. That moment, it never left me, because it wasn't just criticism, it was a message. You are not what I want. I got used to being the disappointment. At parent-teacher conferences, he'd ask why I wasn't top of the class. At family barbecues, he'd introduce me as my son who's figuring it out, even when I was already earning scholarships. On my 18th birthday, he gave me a card that said, "Manhood starts when excuses end." No gift. Just that line. When I got accepted into an architecture program, he didn't even congratulate me. He just asked, "And what job does that lead to? Drawing blueprints for other people?" I worked during the day and took night classes. I never asked him for a cent. I paid my own rent, bought second-hand textbooks, skipped meals when money was tight. He never asked if I was okay. Never once. But if I ever succeeded at something, landed a freelance gig, got a good grade, he'd say, "Lucky break. Don't let it get to your head." By the time I was 24, I had finally started building something for myself. I joined a design firm, moved into a small studio, found a circle of creatives who didn't mock me for my dreams. Life was still hard, but it was mine. Then came the accident. He had slipped on the front steps of the family home, twisted his knee badly. Surgery, crutches, long recovery. He refused a rehab center, said it was for the weak. My mom, God bless her, was already exhausted. She begged me to help, just temporarily. So I moved back in. Just for a month, I told myself. Just until he could walk properly again. I thought maybe he'd see how much I'd grown. That I'd carved a path he never imagined. But on the second day, he looked at the laptop I was using and said, "Still playing with your little design toys, huh?" No gratitude, no warmth, just that same sneer. But I held my tongue. Until the night he crossed the line. I was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing renderings for a project my firm had just landed. It was a big deal, my first lead design. I was nervous but proud. He walked in, glanced over my shoulder and said, "You know, if you had made better choices, maybe you'd own a real house by now, instead of making fake ones on a screen." I didn't respond. He kept going. "You're almost 25. No wife. No assets. No You think lines on a computer make you a man? You're a worthless failure." He said it with no anger. Just matter of fact. Like reading a headline. And for the first time in my life, I stopped absorbing his words and started seeing them for what they were. A man projecting his own fears onto the only son he ever had. I got up, quietly, went to my old room, closed the door, and opened a file I hadn't looked at in 2 years. You see, there was something my father didn't know. When my grandfather passed away, he had left me something privately. A separate deed. A trust. One condition. I couldn't touch it until I turned 25. Guess what I had just turned? Yep, 25. And the property. It was the very house my father now lived in. My grandfather had bought it decades ago. Never told Dad. He rented it back to him. All these years at a family rate. Dad thought was charity. But the trust was clear to Ethan Blake, the only one who truly listened. That night, as my father snored in the room down the hall, I sat in the dark with the papers in my lap. The deed, the trust letter, the the clause that transferred ownership the moment I turned. The house he strutted around in, yelling at me for being soft, for being small. He didn't even own it. And now, legally, I did. I was stunned, not just by the technicality, but by the poetry of it. He spent my whole life calling me a disappointment, while living under my roof. The next morning, I made coffee like nothing had changed. He shuffled in with his cane, grumbling about the front steps again. I almost laughed. This man, so sure of his control, so unaware of the ground shifting beneath him. I could have said something right then, but I did, because the power I had now didn't come from yelling or fighting. It came from knowing. I watched him complain about the coffee brand, the lighting, the weak chairs, and all I thought was, you don't even own the chair you're sitting in. I called Miss Langley, the estate lawyer who handled my grandfather's trust. He confirmed everything. Yes, Ethan, he said, your grandfather wanted to give you a chance to decide what to do. Quietly, cleanly, and if I may say, he was very proud of you. That part almost broke me, because I never knew. My grandfather was kind, but quiet. He and Dad had a distant relationship, but I always thought he just stayed out of things. Turns out he was paying attention, and he'd been waiting for me to realize my own worth. I gave myself two days to decide what I was going to do. Sell the house immediately, kick him out, sit on it and let him keep living in ignorance. But the truth was, I didn't want revenge. Not the messy kind, not the screaming tear the walls down kind. I wanted free, and that meant being done, completely. I drafted a formal notice through Mr. Langley's office. It was polite, professional, effective 30 days from the date of this letter. Tenant Arthur Blake is to vacate the premises, located at 30 days. No shouting, no confrontation, just truth, delivered with the same cold detachment he'd served me for years. I didn't hand it to him myself. I left it on the kitchen counter. He found it that evening. I was in my room when I heard him shout, "What the hell is this?" I stepped into the hallway. He was holding the letter, face red, hand shaking. "You think this is funny?" I didn't flinch. "No," I said. "I think it's overdue." He stared at me like I had grown another head. "This is my house." I walked down the stairs, calm, steady. "No, it was Granddad's. And now it's mine." "You little," I held up the papers. "Don't. Every word is legal. Signed, notarized, witnessed. He made his choice years ago." He blinked. "You're kicking me out? Your own father?" I tilted my head. "The same man who told me I was a failure, that I'd never be a real man. Why should a worthless disappointment own property?" He didn't answer, because for once, he had nothing to say. The days that followed were strange. He barely spoke to me, just shuffled around, muttering, pretending like the walls would disappear if he ignored them hard enough. My mother was visiting her sister in another state during all of this. She had no idea what was unfolding. She'd always tried to keep the peace, to soften his edges, but she also enabled him to some degree. I didn't blame her, but I wasn't protecting him anymore. I got calls from realtors, offers, interest from buyers. The house was valued at just over $30,000, a booming neighborhood. Good bones. Clean history. I accepted a cash offer within 2 weeks. It was done. The night before I moved out, I walked through the halls one last time. My childhood bedroom, the kitchen where I used to sneak snacks, the staircase I'd sit on while my father lectured me from the living room, pretending not to see me. I stood by the front door and whispered, "You never broke me. You just taught me how to rebuild alone." As I drove away the next morning, my phone buzzed. A voicemail from him. "You'll regret this. Family doesn't abandon each other. You'll be back. You always crawl back." I didn't listen to the whole thing. I deleted it before it finished. Because I wasn't crawling anymore. I was walking away. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. It's strange what silence feels like after a storm. The day I left the house, the skies were clear, the air still. No dramatic goodbye. No final screaming match. Just me, loading up the last of my things, while he stayed inside, refusing to watch. I didn't need to see his face. I had seen enough of his expressions over the years. Disappointment, disgust, condescension, but never pride. Not once. And now he could stare at empty walls in a house that no longer belonged to him. I moved into a small but modern loft closer to the city. It wasn't huge, but it had sunlight, peace, and best of all, no ghosts of who I was expected to be. I used a portion of the sale money to fully pay it off. No mortgage, no loans. Every square foot was a reminder. You did this, with nothing handed to you, and nothing borrowed from him. At work things picked up. My project that had been in development was finally I stood in front of the firm's leadership team, presenting my vision for an eco-friendly housing concept. I half expected someone to shut me down mid-sentence. Years of being invalidated had trained my brain to anticipate rejection. But instead, I finished, and they applauded. The CEO even stood up and said, "That's the future right there. You're not just a designer, Ethan. You're a visionary." I almost cried right there in the boardroom. Not because of the praise, but because for the first time in my life, I believed it. Weeks passed. I didn't hear from him. Not a word. I had blocked his number after the voicemail. But part of me wondered, had he moved? Was he still in town? Did he even care? Then one afternoon, I got a message request from a name I hadn't seen in years. Uncle Ray. He was my dad's older brother, a quiet man who kept his distance from most family drama. I opened the message. He's staying at a motel off 3rd Street. Doesn't talk to anyone. Just sits and stares. Thought you should know. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I wanted to fix anything, but because, well, he was still my father. I didn't reply, but I did drive past the motel the next evening. I didn't stop. I didn't get out. Just drove by. And there he was, sitting on a plastic chair outside the room, staring at the sidewalk like it had answers. He looked smaller, not physically, but like something inside had finally given up pretending it was in control. Back at home, I thought about my grandfather again. Why had he left me the house? Why hadn't he told anyone? I pulled out the letter he had included with the trust documents. It was but every word hit like truth. Arthur always measured success in volume. How loud you spoke. How fast you earned. How hard you pushed. But you, Ethan, you build differently. You listen. You think. You care. That's why the house belongs to you now. Use it to begin your life, not to continue his. That last line stuck with me. Not to continue his. I had spent so long trying not to become my father, that I forgot to ask, what do I want to become instead? I started writing again. Not just blueprints and proposals, but journals, eventually blog posts. One entry, titled "He lived in my house while calling me a failure," went viral. Thousands of people commented. Sons, daughters, nieces, neighbors. Same story, different house. They take and take until we realize we're allowed to say no. Thank you for writing what I've always been too scared to say. And just like that, my quiet pain became a loud truth for others. People started emailing me their stories. One girl said her mom refused to come to her graduation because her boyfriend wasn't church approved. A man told me his sister still calls him the weak one, even though he supported their parents financially for a decade. A woman wrote, "My father used to call me a mistake. Now I own the clinic where he's a patient." That one hit hard, because that's exactly what quiet revenge, not screaming in their face, not burning bridges, but building new ones, with your name on the bricks. About 3 months after the house sold, I got another message from Uncle Ray. He finally reached out. Wants to meet. Says it's important. I sat with that text for hours. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the traditional sense. What I felt was more complicated. Not hate. Not even pity. Just closure that hadn't fully sealed. I replied, "Where and when?" We met at a quiet diner just off the highway. It was mid-morning. Mostly empty, just the sound of plates clinking, and an old radio playing Sinatra through dusty speakers. He was already there when I walked in, sitting by the window. A cup of coffee, same stiff shoulders, same hard stare, but older now, slower. I slid into the booth. He looked at me, not with fury, not with pride, just exhaustion. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then he said, "The place is gone." I nodded. "Yes. I sold it." He gave a bitter laugh. "I built that deck myself." I raised an eyebrow. "The one that rotted through." He didn't respond. Instead he stared into his coffee. "I never thought it would be you." "What does that mean?" He sighed. "The one who ended up with it all." I leaned back. "You mean the one who earned it quietly while being torn down loudly?" Still no eye contact. Just silent. Finally he looked up. I messed up. My heart jumped. But I didn't speak. I wanted to hear what came next. I thought if I was hard on you, you'd rise. Be tougher than I ever was. I didn't want you to make the same mistakes. I nodded slowly. But instead you made your own. He flinched. Not because it was cruel but because it was true. He stared out the window. You ever think about coming back? Maybe start over. Build something together. I almost laughed. You mean like father-son bonding? He shrugged. Why not? I stared at him for a long time. Then said, because building with someone requires trust. And I've spent most of my life learning to build without you. He didn't argue. Didn't defend. Just looked away again. The check came. He reached for his wallet. I stopped him. I got it. He frowned. I don't need charity. I smiled softly. It's not charity. It's grace. And I meant it. As I left the diner, I felt lighter. Not because I had forgiven him, but because I no longer needed anything from him to be whole. That night, I posted another blog. Not every apology is sincere. Sometimes it's just the echo of a man realizing he's alone now. It got shared 200,000 times in 2 days. Quiet revenge was no longer just a story. It was a movement. Later that week, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name. Handwritten. Inside a photo. It was me and my grandfather. I was maybe 7. Sitting on his lap. Holding a sketchbook. He was smiling. The caption on the back read, "You always saw the world differently. That's why it will one day be yours." I framed it, hung it above my desk. Because that was the voice I chose to carry forward. Not the one that called me worthless, but the one that saw worth before I even knew it existed. After that diner meeting, I didn't hear from him again. No calls. No letters. Just silent. It wasn't the angry kind. It was the kind of silence that follows when someone finally realizes they've burned every bridge and nobody's coming back with water. I didn't miss him, but I also didn't hate him. What I felt now was clarity. The sale money from the house didn't change me overnight. I still made my own coffee, still rode the subway, still worked long hours. But I wasn't surviving anymore. I was choosing. I took on fewer clients, so I could focus on designing things that actually mattered. Not office buildings, not strip malls, but community spaces, women's shelters, after-school art centers, places I would have needed when I was a kid trying to stay invisible in my own home. One day, I was invited to speak at a design conference. I almost said no. Public speaking wasn't my thing, but the organizer said something that stuck. Your story isn't just about architecture. It's about reclaiming space. And she was right. The talk was simple. I walked on stage, took a breath and started with this. My father called me a failure, so I built a life around the silence he left behind. The room was still. No coughs. No fidgeting. Just focus. I told them about the house. The betrayal. The papers I found. The trust. The moment I realized the man who belittled me lived under my name the whole time. And then I said, some people inherit money. Some inherit trauma. I got both. But I only kept one. The room erupted. Not with noise, with understanding. Afterward, a young man approached me in tears. My dad left me out of his will too. He said I never did anything for the family, but I was the one who stayed and changed his bedsheets when he got sick. I hugged him. Not because I had answers, but because I knew that pain too well. Quiet revenge wasn't about flexing what I had now. It was about showing people that you can walk away without that leaving isn't weakness. It's wisdom. That closure doesn't always come from their words. Sometimes it comes from your choices. A few months later, I visited the neighborhood where the house used to stand. The new owners had repainted the porch, added a garden, replaced the rotted deck. It looked alive. I didn't knock, didn't linger, just stood across the street, smiled once and whispered, "I'm glad you gave it the life I couldn't." Then I turned and left. That night, I posted again. The blog was titled, "I Let Go Without Telling Him." And that was enough. It went viral. Again. Comments flooded in. This is the closure I needed. I didn't get an apology either, but I'm moving forward. We don't have to win. We just have to heal. And that's what quiet revenge became. Not a war cry. A whisper of power. Time passed. Not quickly.
Not quietly, but intentionally. I started getting invitations not just for talks, but for podcasts, panels, and even book collaborations. People weren't just interested in what I built, they were interested in how I got here after being written on. One producer told me, "Everyone's heard stories about success, but your story, it's about surviving being unseen, and still choosing to be visible." And she was right. I wasn't famous. I wasn't rich in the billionaire sense. But I was free. And sometimes that's the loudest wealth of all. Then one day, a message arrived in my inbox. It was from a name I didn't recognize at first. Caroline Blake. My cousin. I hadn't seen her in over a decade. She had moved overseas, built her own life, and distanced herself from the Blake family's weight. Her message was simple. "I saw your interview." I cried. "We all thought you were the lucky one because you got to stay near Grandpa. We didn't know what you were carrying." I replied, "I didn't know either, until I put it down." She messaged back, "If you're ever in London, tease on me. You're not alone anymore." And I realized, even fractured families can contain safe corners. The blog continued to grow. So did the community. I changed the format from just stories to anonymous letters from others like me. We called it the Quiet Wall. Each week, I posted a letter from someone who had finally walked away from their own toxic father, or cruel sister, or manipulative mother-in-law. No names. No details. Just truths. People commented not with advice but with recognition. "I see you. I lived that. You're not broken. You're reborn." One evening I was locking up my office when I saw an envelope taped to the door. No return address. Just Ethan written in messy, jagged handwriting. I knew immediately.
It was him. I didn't open it right away. I made tea, sat on the balcony, watched the sun dip behind the skyline. Only then did I peel the flap open. Inside, a single page. "I don't know what to say anymore. Maybe I never did. Maybe I tried too hard to make you a man the only way I knew how. I see now I failed. You didn't. I don't expect forgiveness. Just wanted to say I see it. I see you, Dad." No signature, just that. And for once, I didn't cry. Because I wasn't holding that weight anymore. The next blog post wasn't about him. It was about me. About what it meant to own your story, not as a weapon, but as a bridge. About how we often inherit wounds before we inherit wisdom. And how healing doesn't always mean reunion. Sometimes it just means not flinching when you hear their name. At the bottom of the post I wrote, "I didn't destroy him. I didn't fight him. I didn't scream. I just walked away, and the silence taught me how loud I truly was." The comments were overwhelming. Quiet revenge was no longer just mine, it was ours. I kept thinking about the house, not the sale, not the money, not even the fact that it had been mine all along. But what it meant, it was never about real estate. It was about being told I would never amount to anything, then realizing I was already becoming everything I needed. When I stood on the porch of that old house, weeks before it sold, I had one final moment alone there. The sun was setting, the birds were quiet, and I placed my hand on the doorframe and whispered, "This was never a home. It was a lesson." One afternoon, I visited a local youth center where I had donated design services. The director, a woman named Tanya, hugged me like we had known each other for years. "You don't know what your work means to them," she said. "These kids, some of them come from homes like you described, places that weren't safe, weren't kind, and now they have a space that feels different." I looked around the art room. Kids painting, laughing, being seen, and I realized I wasn't just healing, I was interrupting generational patterns. Later that night, I wrote a letter to myself. "You didn't fix him. You didn't need to. You fixed the version of yourself that still thought his voice was truth." That letter stayed pinned to my wall. Every time self-doubt returned, I read it aloud. Because when your pain has been loud for years, your healing has to learn how to speak louder. Then something happened I didn't expect. My mother called. She had returned from her sister's months ago, had gotten bits and pieces of what happened. At first she stayed out of it, but now she wanted to meet. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe. She held her tea with both hands, the way she always did when she was nervous. "I didn't know how bad it was," she said quietly. "I think you did," I replied. "But you couldn't stop him." She nodded. "I thought staying silent was protecting you." I shook my head. "Silence isn't protection, it's permission." She cried, soft tears, regretful ones. I didn't hold them against her, because I saw something in her eyes that I never saw in his. Remorse. And that was enough. We're not close now, but we speak, not out of duty, but out of something slowly rebuilding, not a bridge, a path, and that's more than I ever expected. Quiet revenge wasn't about dragging my father's name through the mud. It was about washing my own clean. It was about saying you don't get to be the narrator of my story anymore. I got another letter weeks later, this time from one of my architecture professors. He had seen my interview, read my blogs. You always had something deeper than the rest, he wrote. The others wanted to build towers. You wanted to build spaces that healed. That mad. Keep going. I cried reading that one. Because for years, I believed I was less. Now I knew I was simply different. And in a world obsessed with volume and attention, difference is power. As Quiet Revenge grew, people began sharing their own versions of my story back to me. A daughter who was kicked out of her home at 17, and now ran a non-profit for runaway teens. A son who was told he'd never make it because he liked art more than math, and now owned a gallery. A woman whose mother told her, "You'll always need a man," and who built a wellness brand on self-sufficiency. They didn't scream. They didn't lash out. They just created something better. And that was the core of it all. I didn't sell that house to hurt him. I sold it to liberate myself. I used part of the sale money to fund a mentorship program. It was small at first, just 5 students from underfunded schools. We helped them learn architectural software, introduced them to design firms, gave them tours of construction sites. But most importantly, we told them they belonged. One student, Darius, asked me one day, "Did your dad ever say sorry?" I smiled and shook my head. "No," I said, "but I did." He looked confused. So I explained. I apologized to myself for ever thinking his opinion defined my worth. I started waking up without dread, without guilt, without the voice in my head asking, what would he think? Because it no longer mattered. I wasn't building to prove him wrong. I was building to prove I was right all along. To dream, to try, to be gentle and strong. Then came the email from a publisher. They wanted to compile my blog essays into a book. They'd seen the numbers, the engagement, the power of my work. The title came to me instantly, Blueprints for the Unchosen, because that's what we were, those of us overlooked, dismissed, abandoned. We weren't failures. We were the ones quietly drafting blueprints while everyone else was shouting on rooftops. And now, we were building our own cities. The book launched 6 months later. It didn't hit the top of the charts. It didn't break sales records. But it did exactly what I wanted. It found the quiet ones, the ones hiding in their own stories. And it told them, you are still becoming. And that's enough. Then something I never expected happened. A journalist reached out. She wanted to do a story, not just on me but on my grandfather's decision to leave the house to me. She had done research, spoken to people in the neighborhood, even found my grandfather's former attorney. What she discovered left me stunned. It turns out years before he passed, my grandfather had told a close friend, "My son talks the loudest, but Ethan listens. That boy, he's going to change the world quietly." I sat with that quote for a long time, read it again and again, because in one sentence he had named my pain and my power. The article went live the next week. Headline: The house wasn't the inheritance, the vision was. People shared it like wildfire. My inbox filled again, but this time, not just with stories, with gratitude. Quiet Revenge wasn't a brand anymore. It was a movement, and it all started with one man's cruelty, and my choice not to return it. The most powerful thing I ever built wasn't a building, it was a life that no longer needed his approval. Years ago, I would have given anything to hear him say he was proud of me. Now, I didn't need it, because I was proud of myself, not in the way that shouts from the mountaintop, but in the way that wakes up with peace every morning. The mentorship program expanded. We added more students, launched a summer camp, started building mobile design labs to reach rural schools. I watched these young minds bloom. Kids who had been told they'd never make it, now standing in front of full rooms explaining their architectural concepts. One girl, barely 16, designed a sustainable shelter using recycled shipping containers. She stood up, explained her layout, and said, "This isn't just for people without homes. It's for people who've never felt safe inside one."
I had to step out of the room to collect myself, because I saw myself in her. I saw every unspoken moment of pain, transformed into purpose. At a conference, someone asked me, "If your father were here right now, what would you say to him?" I paused, then answered, "Nothing, because the man I needed him to be never existed, and the man I became doesn't need to explain himself." The room was silent. Then one woman stood and clapped. The rest followed. But in my head I was already miles away, back at that kitchen table, back when he looked me in the eyes and said I was a failure, and I wished he could see now that this was the man he tried to crush. Months later I received a call from a nursing home. They said my father had been admitted, no family contact, no emergency number listed. They only found my name through old insurance files. "Would you like to be involved?" the nurse asked. I thanked her, and said no. It wasn't out of cruelty, it was out of truth, because I had spent so long trying to fix what he broke, until I realized it was never my job to put him back together. He chose isolation, I chose evolution. That evening, I went to the Grove, a community space I helped design. It was quiet, sunlight poured through the tall windows, kids laughed in the next room, and I sat by the window sipping tea, whispering. He called me a failure, but I became the safe place he never offered, not just for myself, but for others. And that was the moment I knew. I didn't inherit just a house. I inherited the courage to build something better. I didn't go to his funeral. That surprises people when they hear it. They ask, "Didn't you want closure?" But what they don't realize is I already had, not in the form of flowers or eulogies, but in the morning light filling my studio, in the kids laughing in spaces I helped create, in the emails that flood in from strangers who say your story helped me finally leave. That's closure. They buried him quietly. No headline, no legacy projects, no trust fund donations, just a man in the ground, whose voice used to sound like thunder but now echoes like a whisper I no longer listen to. And me, I kept building. I turned that one act, the sale of a house, into something bigger than he ever could have imagined. Not because I wanted to prove him wrong, but because I needed to finally prove myself right, that I could be more than what he labeled me, that I could grow beyond the roots he poisoned. The final chapter of my book, Blueprints for the Unchosen, ends with this paragraph. They said I'd never become anything, so I became everything they weren't brave enough to be. Not loud, not ruthless, but soft, and steady, and free. It was shared thousands of times. People tattooed it, quoted it, read it at therapy, read it at weddings. Because this story doesn't belong to just me anymore. It belongs to every person who was told they were too small, too slow, too different, and who rose anyway. Quiet revenge isn't about slamming doors. It's about walking through new ones, without needing applause. It's not about destroying them. It's about choosing peace over their poison. It's not even about getting even. It's about getting free. So if you're still waiting for their apology, stop. Write your own end, not out of spite, but out of strength. Because you don't need them to say you matter. You only need to start living like you do. Thank you for being here. If this story touched something in you, subscribe to Quiet Revenge. We tell stories that remind you, you are not broken. You were just always bigger than the cage they kept you in. And now, you're finally free.